Wisp Sports Radio, the voice of women in sport.
Thank you for downloading Tucker Center Talks. This is Season 1, Episode 5. Thank you for listening to Tucker Center Talks, a podcast from the Tucker Center for Research on Girls and Women in Sport at the University of Minnesota and a co-production with Wisp Sports. I'm your host for Tucker Center Talks, Dr. Nicole Lavoie, Director of the Tucker Center. In this podcast, I'll be talking to Dr. Nancy Lowe, a professor in higher education and program director of marketing for the UNLV College of Education. Welcome, Dr. Lowe.
Thank you, Dr. Lavoie. It's nice to be on this podcast with you.
Of course, it's wonderful to have you. And just for the listeners who don't know Dr. Nancy Lowe, she studied marketing, sponsorship, and gender equity in women's sports since the 1990s. She's a longtime Title IX consultant and author of a newly published Routledge Handbook of the Business of Women in Sport, which we're going to talk about later. And her most recent research focuses on equal pay in athletics, as well as sponsorship, marketing, and media coverage disparities between women's and men's sports. And like me, and many of you listening, she's a former college athlete and college coach in track and field. And last but certainly not least, she's a Tucker Center affiliated scholar. So we have a lot to discuss this morning, don't we, Dr. Lowe?
Yes, we do.
So I want to ask you two specific things. First, about the current economic model, and then secondly, the impetus for the handbook of the business of women's sport. But let me just set up the landscape for the economic model to provide listeners some context. So on one hand, we have record numbers of girls and women playing sport. We have half of sport fans are women. We have 84% of sport fans that are interested in women's sport. WNBA coverage is off the charts. The Women's World Cup was super successful. We've got Megan Rapinoe as Sports Person of the Year on the cover of Sports Illustrated. But then conversely, we have only 2 to 3% of network media coverage and cable television covering women's sport. We have very little sponsorship for women's sport, and female athletes are fighting for equal pay for the same job. So this is definitely a paradox. So I want you to help us shed light on this current economic model for women's sport. What is going on here? Help us understand.
It certainly does. It does seem like you have contradictory examples of what's happening, right? On the one hand, for years and years and years with Title IX, the goal was to get more participation in sport. And we've seen that really be very, very successful, 400% increase, right, at the college level with women participating in college athletics since 72 to now, which is a fantastic increase. So the number of women who have participated has grown, which along with that, then the number of women who are interested in sport as fans has grown, right? So you look at the NFL, NBA, all of those, and they have anywhere from 35 to 45% of their fans are actually women, which is very important for their economic model. So, those kinds of numbers are certainly something that we and those who support women's sport and teach, we advocate for those kinds of indicators, and we are increasingly needing to use those kinds of indicators with decision makers to say, look, there is something happening here that's very new and different from the narratives that have been used for years to describe women's sport. So in essence, all of what you just reported are the positives that we can use to demonstrate that things are quite different in the landscape today economically than they have been in the past. What you reflected on the other side, the 2 to 4% of the media coverage, the ridiculously low investment from a sponsorship standpoint, that is dictated by decision makers that tend to be white males that hold the power within the institution of sport, so the systems, right? And also within the corporate organizations that are the sponsors. So the Budweisers, the Visas, those folks, they're also having the challenges with creating diversity within their own organizations. And so at the leadership level, I think we have 5% of the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are women, right? So 95% men, which means, again, decision makers are predominantly men, and they don't see the value that is offered by women's sport. So that's where, on the one side, the paradox is now something that we can work with because we can use the data to support the argument that the narratives that have been used around women's sport in the past are needing to be changed.
So how do we make the argument then and change the narrative to convince decision makers at the top, who are mostly, as you pointed out, white men? Do we use this argument to say, hey, this is the right thing to do? It's the moral imperative to support women's sport because we're half of the population? Or is that sort of an old, outdated argument? And what might a new way to frame this be?
I'm really glad you asked that question because, you mentioned that I started studying this back in the 90s. And certainly during that period of time, Title IX was something that we leaned on. It was just really beginning to have any impact. You think about the first real case where there were punitive and compensatory damages, which was 1992, right? So in my mind, Title IX really didn't even take effect for 20 years. So in the 90s, we really were talking about Title IX and gender equity from sort of the legal mandate, the morally right thing to do. And I've argued for that for years and years. I tried to bring to attention Sport Business Journal a few years ago the lack of women in when they're highlighting the most influential people in sport, and somewhat of that shaming approach, right? Where it's like, why are you only acknowledging men that are influential in the leadership of sport?
Hey, how about us over here?
Exactly. And pointing it out as you often do through data, right? Let's look at the numbers and then really trying to help them see how discriminatory they're being just in their own mindset. But when we think about how we're going to change the argument, we now have data that shows that women make 80% of all purchase decisions, right? And we've known this for some time, but finally the folks in decision-making roles are starting to pay attention to this. So what it means is women have economic clout. They're making decisions for themselves. They're making decisions for their families. 50% of all car purchases are made by women, right? And so you've seen a little bit of a shift now in the advertising where there's more women that are being featured in those kinds of ads because they're recognizing that women are in a powerful position economically. So that's the shift that we have to make. We can't argue just from the morally right thing to do. A lot of that has to do with the fact that the buckets of money that are available through those who really sponsor sport, which is the lifeline of sport. If you argue from the morally right standpoint, you're going to get access to what's really their corporate social responsibility budget. And that is a very shallow pocket, shall we say. There's not a lot of money in that part of any corporate business compared to
small bucket.
Right. Compared to the amount of money that they have available for marketing and advertising, right? That's a deep pocket. And so that's the place where we really have to argue from the economic viability of how this is in their best interest. They're going to be able to get greater market share, new market segments, if they in fact will invest in women's sport. And that's where the money is available to actually support women's sport in that way.
So it's almost a new chicken and the egg, because the old argument, and the current argument is nobody's interested in women's sport. Therefore, we're not going to support it because no one's interested. But if we don't support it, then how can you be interested in it? Now, what you're saying is if we invest, if you build it, they will come. So if you invest and sponsor and show women's sport, more people will be interested in it, which drives sponsorship, which drives revenue, which drives more interest. So it's a reverse chicken and the egg. So that's the new model we're trying to construct. Is that accurate?
It's accurate, although I wouldn't say it's a new model. It's the model that has worked in men's sport, mainstream sport, forever. So you look at ESPN. or you look at Sports Illustrated, whatever type of sport media you want to look at. And when you see that they're spending, enormous amounts of time and money creating audiences for those sport properties, well, when they create that audience, they're also creating value. And that value is what the sponsors then want to invest in. And that's why you will have the Budweisers and the Visas and the big corporations that are investing in the NFL and Major League Baseball, et cetera. So in essence, the media becomes the oxygen, right? It is the oxygen that breathes life into the model. So once the sponsors get on board, then they can do all sorts of activation and things that create more interest. They're serving their own marketing objectives in this way, but their marketing objectives work hand in glove with the marketing objectives of the sport entities as well. So, you look at, say, the Olympics and all the sponsors that want to get on board with the Olympic Games, right? That's not possible if we don't have that relationship. So the media driving the audiences and the interest, which then drives the sponsorship value, which then continues the cycle towards more interest, more need for media coverage, and on and on. And the way you described it was actually accurate. With women's sport, when there isn't media coverage, there isn't oxygen to feed that audience building, to feed that interest among the marketing and sponsorship piece. And everyone on my side of this equation, the sport business folks, know that sport cannot exist today without sponsorship. It's just that simple. So, that's where we are. We have now the numbers to show that there are great audience numbers. There are growing fans. There is, if you give people the opportunity to buy merchandise and invest, it's happening. I say if, because the WNBA doesn't do a very good job of that. So there's a number of areas that we can continue to improve, but yeah, there's every reason to believe that this approach that's used for mainstream sport for years would be only just as successful for women's sport if we followed that model.
So why isn't it? Because we have argued for years that if you just show women's sport, the fans will come. And in fact, the fans are there despite the fact that we don't see women's sport on TV in the numbers that we would wish we would see them.
Mm-hmm.
So why is it that media companies will not give the oxygen to women's sport? What despite all the data we have and the evidence that's there, why is this not changing faster than it is?
The same reason that women don't receive equal pay, right? The same reason that women are not in Congress and the House in the numbers that they should be. I mean, this is all the same type of, whether it's implicit bias or it's intentional bias, it's discrimination. At the end of the day, there's just a different perspective when it comes to women. And so what I think is interesting at this point in time, the visibility of the Women's World Cup that came about this summer really created an opportunity for a larger conversation around how women are being treated, right? So the equal pay is something that really resonates across industries. Should the women's soccer team be paid equal to the men or even better?
Same
based
job.
on their performance?
It's a national team, right? And they perform better for years and years. They're world champions 4 times over. The men, I don't even know the last time they even won a World Cup game. Same team, same job. The national team should be same pay. That seems like a no-brainer. So again, what's going on here?
Well, the difference is that, believe it or not, they started those lawsuits in 1999, right? I mean, they've been fighting the federation since the very beginning of their ways of winning. But what is different, if you think about this last World Cup, the fans in the stands were actually cheering equal pay, right? Cheering equal pay when the team won. So that tells you that the fans are paying attention and they're unhappy. Who cares about the fans most? The media and the sponsors. So the sponsors also got on board. If you think about the post World Cup, we had Budweiser putting an ad in New York Times saying, will you watch when it's over, right? So trying to encourage people to understand that you can't just get on the bandwagon and be there during the World Cup and then stop watching women's soccer.
Yeah, you've got to sustain it, right? You got to sustain the viewership, and the fans have to
Right.
take ownership in that.
They do, but it's pretty powerful to all of a sudden have sponsors like Budweiser and Visa stepping forward. Visa also had a big spread, I think it was actually in USA Today, talking about like really putting pressure on the US Soccer Federation, saying be on the right side of history. Okay, now in each of those cases, they really are kind of arguing from the moral imperative standpoint. But the reality is Visa and Budweiser are businesses. They care about the return on their investment. They do want to do the right thing because that makes people feel good about their brand, right? So maybe some of these sponsors of these folks that are fans of women's sport will start feeling good about Budweiser and Visa and want to support them. But at the end of the day, they're only going to continue to invest if in fact there is a return on their investment. That's how it works, right? That's the part where we need folks that understand women's sport to make those connections and help those sponsorships be successful. But all the indicators now, as you pointed, suggest that we have that opportunity.
Well, and what's even more interesting in the Women's World Cup is that when our own soccer federation is not stepping up for equal pay, we have brands and products that are stepping in to fill the gap, which really shouldn't be the model of equal pay and economic parity. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, you know what? I saw that as really a positive because in essence, you've got the sponsors leading the way. And to some degree, you could look at that like Nike has been that way in some cases, right? So sponsoring athletes that have been activists when when the governing bodies are kind of shunning those athletes. And, Nike is known for that because they're willing to kind of push the social envelope at times. But when you have the sponsors taking the lead, in essence, what that says is those people that are in the power positions in the media and in the governing bodies not recognizing the need to change, it's again somewhat pushing them, shaming them into it, right? Like, you all need to get on board. You need to do this because we're tired of waiting. These sponsors have been invested in sport for decades. They know how the game is played. They're starting to understand that they have power that can be used in a positive way. And that's what we saw with the Women's World Cup. So it really was a game changer in that sense.
Well, and so I think you've got sort of the ground up. You've got athletes post Title IX that have grown up playing sports their whole life, just like their male colleagues and peers, and they expect equity. They expect to be treated equally, seen equally, valued equally. It's not just, oh, we're so happy to play and we have a team. We actually are playing and we're kicking ass and we deserve to have some equity. So the change is coming from the ground up. Let's just use the Women's World Cup team arguing and suing their federation for equal pay. And then you've got sponsors from the top down saying that they can leverage their voice and power and money. And I'm wondering if finally these two things are going to meet in the middle where we really move the needle to create some social change for girls and women in sport. That would be my hope.
Yeah, me too. Since we've been doing this work for a long time, you look for that tipping point, right? You look for that one little thing that's finally going to make a difference. And I really am looking at the current landscape and thinking we're finally getting there. We're finally getting to a point where they simply can't be ignored. Think about ESPN. The thing that is difficult for me to understand is when they have invested. So think about the College Women's World Series. When they have invested, it's just blossomed. The numbers of people that are following women's college softball because of that coverage, it's exemplary in what you want from a media standpoint and from a sponsorship standpoint, a fan standpoint, every single example. So, the model is there, the examples are there, the sponsors are coming to the fore. And I think the last thing that you just pointed out is, our generation, you and I, we were the apologetic, right? We were the ones that were just like so deeply grateful for any opportunity, right? Thank you, thank you, thank you to the power brokers for including us. Well, this generation, absolutely not. They expect, as you said, and that expectation then is translated through social media. So when they don't get what they think they deserve, they're happy to go on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, wherever they need to be, and kind of let the world know, like, this isn't okay. And, and sometimes they do it in fun and interesting ways, and sometimes they do it in provocative ways, but they're just not willing to stand back and take it. They have higher expectations, and they should.
completely agree. And I think this tipping point, I guess I'm cautiously optimistic, but I've heard this, 99 was a tipping point. And then, 2006, I'm just making that up, is the year of the woman. And now then 5 years later, no, this is the year of the woman. And so is 2019 really a tipping point or not? I don't know. It's too early to tell, but I'm certainly hopeful that this energy and the data and the athlete activism and the corporate sponsorships sort of coming together to create a synergistic energy, I'm really hoping that's true.
Well, I think we have reason to believe that change is happening. Change is rarely quick, but we do have a situation where the media landscape is really being disrupted in certainly interesting ways. So ESPN is having its own challenges right now because there's a diversification of the media landscape. So the NBA records, for example, or NBA viewership right now is down. And a lot of folks are kind of going, what's happening there? Well,
but the WNBA was up.
Well, and that's what's interesting is like for all of this time, those of us who want to follow women's sport have had to be intentional. We've had to seek it out. We've had to really kind of learn how to get what we want. So we're good at it, right? Versus those folks that just, passively consume the NBA, they don't go seek it out. It just happens to be wherever they want it to be.
Well, now that that's channels changing, 24/7. Mm-hmm. Here it is, everywhere I look.
Yeah. But it's changing, right? Because now we've got millennials and Gen Zs that are watching Twitch. They're watching eSport. They're not tuning into the NBA. So things are shifting for those mainstream properties as well, which may in fact also work to the benefit of women's sport because our fans tend to be loyal. They have had to seek it out for years, so they know how. And there's more and more reason that people are getting on board with following women's sport. We don't have the same number of conflicts and controversies and social problems by and large that you see like just right now, the NFL, right, in the media for yet another questionable behavior on behalf of former players.
Well, I'm really going to remain cautiously optimistic until the data tells me otherwise. But let's just wrap up by having you tell the listeners a little bit more about the Handbook of Business of Women's Sport, which is the first and groundbreaking book of its kind. And you and your colleague co-edited it. And full disclosure, I also have a chapter in said book. And I find it a really interesting compilation of topics. So why did you decide to do this? And what are the implications of this handbook for the listeners?
Well, my colleague, Andrea Guerin, the two of us have this perspective that I've shared largely on this podcast that, there is this business side to women's sport that is just not being visible, not being talked about, not being really studied even. And the folks like you and I who we teach students, right? We do our research. We found that our colleagues are using examples primarily from mainstream men's sport in their teaching, right? They're not talking about the WNBA or the WTA or the LPGA when they're teaching. And one of the things that we thought was, well, if we create this handbook, they will have absolutely no excuse for not doing so. We have phenomenal contributors from around the world. The only continent that's not represented is Africa. And so, we've covered everything from, like we've talked about here, media and technology, to the financial and economic side, to the sociological side, the marketing side. Everything is there, and it's in one nice little handbook. So there's a lot that folks can draw from. The other side of this that I often wonder about, the commissioner of the LPGA is a guy that came really from the corporate side. He wasn't a sport professional, so to say, prior to becoming the commissioner. And think about how many times we have men leading women's sport. So what have they ever done to educate themselves on the nuances and the uniqueness of the properties that they're going to be leading? Same thing with our new, Kathy Engelbrecht, the WNBA. She came from Deloitte. I mean, she's a former basketball player, but who knows if she really understands what what the nuances are with women's sport that are so unique and make it so challenging compared to, running a corporate 500 company. So the goal was, I guess, twofold in that sense. We wanted to create it for folks who teach and do research, but we also would love for it to be a resource for folks in the industry to really understand and do a deep dive in understanding women's sport as a business.
Great. Well, I would invite everyone who cares about women's sport as a scholar, as an advocate, as a consumer, as a fan, as someone who wants to support women's sport. This is really a great handbook to help us really have data to, again, help change the narrative and perspectives about what really is going on and the potential of women's sport. So I really appreciate that you're able to come on the podcast this morning. And any last comments for the listeners about the marketing and promotion of women's sport that you want to sort of hammer home?
It just mostly, it does matter. It matters what you watch. It matters what you consume. We have entities like She Is now that are telling people, to at least watch women's sport and make that a priority. And just to own the power that we have economically. I think we still need women to really understand that we can be a driving force. That companies like Visa and Budweiser want your dollars. They want your interest in their business. So we can be vocal about it. That's what men do. They complain. If they don't see what they want to see on the media, if they're unhappy with something, they complain. So women need to take a little bit of ownership and say, hey, we really care about these things and we think you need to support them and invest in them.
Great. So that's a call to action for everyone listening. We need your eyeballs on the screens, whether it's digital or media. We need you to click on stories. We need you to use your voices in social media and or otherwise and make your demands and your needs be heard. And I think that's a great way to end the podcast. So thank you, Dr. Lowe, for joining us on Tucker Center Talks today.
It's been good fun. Thanks, Dr. Lavoie, for having me on your show.
Conversations from the world of women's sports. This is Wisp Sports Radio.
I'd love to hear from you, so tweet us at Tucker Center or at Wisp Sports, or to me directly at Dr. Sports Psych. Be sure to check out our website at tuckercenter.org, and you can also follow us on Facebook or Instagram. You can find the show notes with links and resources for this episode at wispsports.com. Look for Tucker Center Talks under the Listen tab. Now, while you're there, you can find a lot of conversations from around the world of people who care deeply about women's sports. Thank you for listening and helping us turn up the volume on women's sport. That's a wrap for episode 5 of Tucker Center Talks. I'll be back in 2020 for season 2. I'm your host, Dr. Nicole Lavoie, signing off to make a difference in the lives of girls and women in sport.